The next presentation is again not online but a video, so unfortunately you cannot ask questions, but I hope it can be started soon. It's from Moritz Mercker.
Yes, hello. So this short talk is about habitat modeling for red kites, and this is a collaboration work with Bioconsult and the technical office RAB. And just a little fun fact, because I unfortunately can't be here in person today, I had prepared and recorded the talk beforehand, and now I got a call from the RABs last evening, your talk is in the wrong language. So I wrongly thought that the conference was in German, so I quickly rewrote the presentation yesterday night, so please forgive me if there are still some words in German or spelling mistakes somewhere. So the background to this is as follows. In the current amendment of the Federal Nature Conservation Act, it is written that a proposal is to be presented that deals with the mathematical calculation of the collision probability. And against this background, Bioconsult and our office Bionum have been commissioned by the Hessian Ministry of the Environment to carry out a pilot study dealing with this issue. And special mention should be made of the intensive technical support coordinated by the KNE, on the one hand via the sub-working group on probabilistics, also known as UAG2, which is made up of representatives of the federal and state ministries and interest groups, and a project accompanying working group with experts from the fields of biology, species protection law, statistics, etc., which made the whole thing very constructive and objective, I think. So the key question was, if we have a given specific constellation, a breeding site, a bird species and a local habitat and a specific wind turbine, can we then calculate the bird strike risk using probabilistic or mathematical methods? And if so, with what certainty of estimation? A core problem of previous probabilistic approaches was that there were large uncertainties in the parameters used, such as avoidance behavior or habitat preferences, which were simply not known in detail. To get away from speculation, we first needed a comprehensive database consisting of bird movement data, local habitat information, and wind turbine locations and variables. And in a second step, here shown in green, it was then a question of empirically extracting all these parameters from these data that finally go in our collision risk model using appropriate statistical methods. For example, the avoidance behavior or the intensity of use of different habitat types. And then, in the final step, here shown on the right-hand side, we then bring everything together in a hybrid model, which on the one hand predicts the flight distribution probability for each local situation. That means a space use model, and then fusing this with a collision risk model. However, this complexity only refers to the creation or parameterization of the model. In application, it is relatively simple. You only need the coordinates of the breeding sites, the local habitat information, which you usually get from remote sensing databases such as current land cover, and the exact data on wind turbines, or on the wind turbine of interest. And then the model calculates the bird strike risks, which of course finally has to be assessed in terms of nature conservation. Yes, all the statistical analysis for the parameterization of the model worked well, I have to say. Here you can see an example for the determination of the avoidance behavior on the mesoscale, and the blue line here, the horizontal line, represents the undisturbed behavior, and here we measure a clear avoidance, this black line, with relatively small statistical uncertainties. And here you can see an example of the 3D space use prediction. I simply cut out a 3D cube containing both the nest on the left and the wind turbine, the nest shown in green and the wind turbine with a yellow dot. And here we apply step by step first the predicted habitat use, here shown in B. Then we combine it with the avoidance effects shown in C. Then we combine it with the habitat use as a function of distance from the nest in D. And finally, we combine it with the flight height distribution. And from this, we can calculate eventually the number of seconds per season in the risk area for each specific local situation, and finally apply a collision risk model. And the whole thing is very well founded empirically. Yes, what about the model validation? That is testing our model prediction against empirical external data. Well, here we had 3 different, completely independent empirical studies on true collisions or number of seconds in the risk area, and in all 3 cases our model predicted the number of collisions or the stay time in the risk area very well. Here on the right hand side you see the comparison with Progress, a large study where carcasses were searched for 3 years in different wind farms, and our model predicts the number of victims fairly accurately, but with much smaller confidence intervals than in the original study, because in the original study the true number of carcasses had to be corrected for detection bias and removal by scavengers, for example. I mean, that's the beauty of building the whole thing on big data anyway. The uncertainties in the predicted carcass numbers or bird strike risks are very small. But in this talk we want to consider a very specific aspect of the hybrid model, namely the habitat selection, respectively the habitat use modeling for the red kite. And here it was very quickly clear that we will establish a collaboration with the technical office RAB, since they have much high quality data and a broad experience with respect to these questions, so that we decided to join forces in order to better understand habitat selection. And the first question was, how good is our previous habitat use prediction for the red kite, which we use in the current hybrid model? For this purpose, members of the probabilistic sub-working group selected a GPS-tracked red kite, a priori, called Athos, and it is characterized on the one hand by the fact that there is a lot of good GPS data from the past 3 years, and secondly, it breeds very close to a wind farm. The shortest distance between the breeding site and the turbine is only 160 meters, which from a classical distance point of view is very critical. Here on the left you can see a zoom on the breeding site. This is the yellow marker, and the satellite image shows the three nearest wind turbines. And from the habitat point of view, the whole thing is quite classic. The bird breeds at the edge of the forest, with the forest extending to the south. The dark blue habitat here on the right hand side, and especially to the north and west there's a lot of grassland, and not far to the north there is in addition a settlement. So the first question was, can the hybrid model give us a real-world estimate of Athos habitat use? For this, it was of course conceptually important that we do not choose the bird, but that it is given to us, because otherwise one could think we are cherry picking. Yes, how does the hybrid model differ in terms of habitat use prediction from other approaches proposed in the recent years? Well, on the one hand, habitat use is extracted strictly empirically from tracking data, and statistical uncertainties can also be quantified, which makes the whole thing maximal objective, I think. And secondly, because we do not only look at the influence of the habitat itself, but also at other variables that depend on it. For example, the closest distance to the respective habitat type. And it is easy to underestimate the consequences of the latter. Let me show you an example. Let us assume we have a super habitat for the red kite north and south of the breeding site, here shown in red. And then, in the best case scenario, this would also be assessed using previous methods, and then usually this is combined with the intensity of use depending on the distance to the breeding site, as shown here on the right, and then evaluated in terms of bird strike risk. You then have finally a quite circular home range, which can differ, of course, in the different habitats. Yes, the problem is that this scenario is often very far from reality. On the one hand, the bird does not fly by chance, but knows where it has to go. It knows its home range. This is what we called a cognitive map in our probabilistic study. It flies specifically to good areas, which are then these bird highways. I tried to draw it here on the right-hand side, and that can only be described by variables that measure the distance to the different habitat types. And the second problem is there are barriers. Red kites do not usually fly long distances over forest, settlement or water, but since they often breed at the edge of the forest, this to a large extent dictates the direction in which they use their home range, and this can make the home ranges highly non-circular. And I didn't paint it as shown on the left for nothing. This is exactly the situation at Athos. On the right you can see a summary of the tracking data from the last 3 years, and you can see this strong orientation towards the north. And we have looked at a lot of tracking data from different birds, and I would say in over half of the cases we have a home range that is clearly skewed in a certain direction, mainly because of these barrier effects, I think. Based on all these findings, we have started to revise the habitat part of the hybrid model in the last months, and news compared to the published version are: firstly, we now calculate all habitat use parameters separately by sex, as there are indications of clear differences in various papers, including the recently published Mammen et al. Paper. Then, secondly, we have started to formulate and use variables that quantify the barrier effects of forests and settlements. And thirdly, up to now, we have had the distance variables, so the variables measuring the closest distance to each habitat. We had then linear in the model, which meant, up to now, for example, related to the distance to the nearest settlement, we measure an attraction effect of settlements. But in the linear model, the closer we are at the settlement, the more red kites we have, which then predicts the highest red kite densities in the center of the village. This is of course not true. But now we measure nonlinear interactions or correlations, and you can see very clearly here on the left-hand side that only the edge of the settlement is attractive, which is here on the x-axis just below 0, and further inwards the use decreases very dramatically. That is exactly what we see in the tracking raw data, that the edges of villages are attractive, but of course red kite abundance strongly decreases in the direction of the center. So now back to the case study. For the area around the breeding site of Athos, we have now let our hybrid model predict the relative utilization. Of course, we were very excited about this because we had not had the time for such comparisons so far. I had rather blindly trusted my statistics in this habitat aspect until now. Very important here, we have fitted the hybrid model without having the data from Athos in the data set. They only make up a small fraction of the total data, of course, but it's still better for the feeling, so you avoid even a hint of circular reasoning, so to say. And this is what the prediction looked like. Only for visualization purposes, I cut out the prediction directly around the breeding site. Otherwise, the intensive use there would dominate everything. And when we compared it with the real tracking data, the black dots here on the right, we were pretty blown away, I have to say, in a positive sense, because the model predicts the use relatively precisely. You can only complain at a very high level. For example, you can see that the tracking data is shifted very slightly to the left compared to the prediction. And this good prediction surprised us a bit, because one assumes a highly individuality of the animals with respect to habitat choice, whereas our model predicts, of course, the habitat use for, let's say, the average red kite. But perhaps this high individuality does not exist at all. The variables were simply not known until now, and at first glance the home ranges really do look individual. And we were also surprised by this good agreement, since we have not yet made a large part of the planned habitat model improvements. For example, we still mainly use the very coarse Coron land cover 18 habitat, but if you take a close look at the tracking data, you can actually see fine structures in the use that we have not yet been able to resolve. It looks a bit like field edges to me. But we are currently investigating variables which have a much finer spatial and temporal resolution. So in conclusion, I would think that our model is already well suited for a habitat use prediction, even if it may not fit for all birds as well as it did with ATOS. I think it's definitely a significant improvement compared to previous methods, partly because we can now map also this asymmetry of the home range. What can also be displayed is the predicted relative habitat use in the area, which means without any reference to nests, which is interesting, for example, if you have tracking data of non-breeders, but of course also for characterizing risk or non-risk areas with respect to wind turbines. Yes, let's move to the calculated collision risks shown here on the right hand side. The exciting thing for me to see here was that the collision risk at the three very close wind turbines are not that exorbitant. Why is that? Well, if you look at the small print here on the right hand side, you can see that these three wind turbines have a very high hub height in combination with a small rotor, so that, simply put, the bird almost always flies well below the danger zone. So if I virtually lower these wind turbines and specify a modern rotor, I arrive at a completely different order of magnitude, of course. If we add up the collision risks for all 8 wind turbines, we arrive at a value of 0.09, which means that on average one individual collides every 11 years. This all fits quite well with the fact that ATOS is still alive despite the close proximity to the wind turbine. So now I can start using the hybrid model to see how can I reduce the collision risks. In this example, I have simply placed a circular, unattractive habitat where the 3 densest wind turbines are located. Alternatively, you could of course place a very attractive habitat to the east of the nesting site to draw the birds away. This might have been a more positive approach, but we are only concerned here with examples. And you can clearly see above the resulting change in the habitat prediction up here, the use shifts further to the east and the collision risk is reduced by 1/3. Alternatively, of course, one can also change the dimensions of the wind turbines, for example, the height of the lower rotor run. So we can use these mathematical comparisons or hypothetical comparisons to define the optimal bundle of measures for a specific local situation, so to speak, in order to reduce the collision risk below a certain threshold. Yes, I have already indicated that despite the promising results with the habitat model, we are not yet at the end, but rather in the middle of the story. So the overall strategy is currently as follows. We are testing a very large number of land use variables from different sources. Up to now, we only had the Coron land cover habitat, but now we are also looking at variables with a much better temporal and spatial resolution, including information on where and when what was cultivated, for example. And all the possible barrier variables are derived from that, and all the possible nonlinear dependencies. And we also look at seasonal effects. Some habitats are only attractive in certain seasons. So you end up with over 3,000 variables to study, And here we apply efficient variable selection techniques, pick out the 100 most important ones, and then we look in a second step at those to see if there are differences between them in terms of sex, landscape, so large scale landscape, or weather variables before we fit the final habitat model. And the first step, that means the selection of the 100 most important variables, has already been carried out using a test data set. This looks quite wild now, but in essence it is clearer than one might think at first glance. The x-axis shows the selected variables, the y-axis shows the strength of the measured effect, and the size of the black circles shows for how many individuals the corresponding variable was selected. And the first thing you notice, for example, is the big black dot up here, which is not entirely surprisingly a variable that measures the distance to the breeding site, which is one of the most dominant drivers. Here on the left, also with quite high values, are the variables that measure barrier effects, which we have already seen play an important role. These, for example, are all variables that have to do with grassland. Not surprisingly, they are very present. Just like the variables that depend on the forest or trees. And if you look into the fine print, so to speak, you will find many other things that make sense, such as the fact that especially crops with strong growth height have a seasonal effect on red kites. Yes, and now we have to test how far these variables depend on gender, landscape or weather, and then we will have a revised version of the model, which we will of course test intensively against real land use patterns from GPS data, as I showed for Athos as an example. Yes, regarding the outlook, we think that the hybrid model, including the revised habitat modeling, can be ready for the red kite at the turn of the year. And in the coming year, we want to adapt the entire approach to a handful of other species for which a solid database is already available. And yes, at this point, thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I would like to thank all those with whom I have worked and still work on this project in a very constructive and enjoyable way, especially the colleagues from Technical Office RAB and Bioconsult, and of course the sub-work group Probabilistics and the KNE with their great technical support. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot to Moritz. He cannot hear us. But we have the option that we can put a few questions to Reinhard Raab, who was involved in this analysis, and I guess he is online.
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, confirmed. The first question comes in a few seconds.
Yes, so my problem is you starting your model, you think that that the red kite where the wind turbines in the home range, that they are equally threatened by the wind turbine than red kites from somewhere else, or taking the wind turbine as the major point. Is it clear that most of the red kites that are killed by a wind turbine are from nearby, or are the red kites that are killed by a wind turbine from far away? So this is a major input that you give into the model, and if this is not carefully checked, the model is maybe in vain.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So on the one hand, the first thing we have to consider is that this model is built of many pieces, and those pieces, they work together, and every single one of those pieces is like the best guess that we can do at the moment. So this study was carried out by Moritz Mercker and also Bioconsult within some months, and they worked on building a framework that enables to answer or to bring together a lot of different topics. So on the one hand, we have habitat modeling. On the other hand, we have the collision risk. And of course, if you want to bring so many different topics together, it is not possible in this first step of the study to include every single different aspect in detail. So what they did is they used a first analysis on the behavior of avoidance. So what Hartwig Schlüter was talking about is that we need to evaluate the avoidance behavior of the red kite based on more criteria than just the red kite. So what we need to do is to differentiate between breeding birds and non-breeding birds and juvenile birds. And of course, within the Live Eurokite project, such study is ongoing. So we are differentiating between juvenile birds. For example, we noticed, of course, that when the birds grow older, although their relative collision risk increases, like every bird has a similar stable risk to collide, independent is the breeding bird, non-breeding bird. The risk is always in every year pretty much the same if we talk about those big numbers in the Live Eurokite project on European scale. There is not a big difference between a second year bird, a third year bird, or fourth year bird that we can yet identify. But of course, you have to understand if there is a connection between the time spent and the risk to collide, that is this one-to-one proportion. Because what the model assumes right now is that if a bird spent 10,000 hours in a specific area, then the risk is 10,000 times higher than if it just spends 1 hour there. And that's exactly what Hartwig Schlüter is talking about, that when we look at the mortality cases, we can realize, if we analyze them in detail, that the number that we assume based on this model might be too high for the breeding birds close to wind turbines, because we assume this one-to-one proportion. And it might be that in reality, a bird that spends 10,000 hours in an area is not 10,000 times more endangered to collide than a bird that spends only 1 hour there. But based on the behavior that the bird learns how to deal with this wind turbine, it might only be 10, 20, or 50 times more risky for this bird. So the breeding birds, of course, they do have, or from what we know by now, it is to assume that they have a higher risk to collide with wind turbines that are close to the nest. But the degree, if it is like 10 times, 100 times higher than for another bird, this still has to be evaluated. And within the Live Eurokite project, we're dealing exactly with this topic, and we will make a publication on this topic. So on the avoidance behavior of red kites of different age groups to wind turbines. And I think, yeah, this is what we need to do, that we really work step by step to improve the model, to include new steps, to include like new frameworks into the model, and to improve the knowledge that we have right now. So we have like the best knowledge that is out there included in the model, but of course there's still a possibility to improve in some questions.
Okay, thank you, Rani. I think that was a long and intense answer. There's an addition.
An additional question. So the main point is, what does the court ask finally? And what the court is asking is, makes it an ecological sense? And what is the ecological argument behind this? So from ecological point of view, the individual has not the big value. The population has a value, and I think we have to discuss by both what the court wants and what we can do. And if we do something and the court is not asking this, what you are doing, then yeah, you are in two different worlds, and this does not bring us forward.
Thanks for this additional statement. I guess it was not a question, rather a clarification. So are there any other questions? No? In this case, thanks a lot. And we can straight ahead and in time step to the next. Reini, thanks a lot for
Yeah, thank you
giving
very
the
much.
answer.